Listen to the words Christ spoke to his disciples. Matthew 22, 1 through 14. Once more Jesus spoke to them in parables, saying, "The kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who gave a wedding banquet for his son. He sent his slaves to call those who had been invited to the wedding banquet, but they would not come. Again, he sent other slaves, saying, 'Tell those who have been invited, look, I have prepared my dinner. My oxen and my fat calves have been slaughtered, and everything is ready. Come to the wedding banquet.' But they made light of it and went away, one to his farm, another to his business. While the rest seized his slaves, mistreated them, and killed them. The king was enraged. He sent his troops, destroyed those murderers, and burned their city. Then he said to his slaves, 'The wedding is ready, but those invited were not worthy. Go therefore into the main streets and invite everyone you find to the wedding banquet.' Those slaves went out into the streets and gathered all whom they found, both good and bad. So the wedding hall was filled with guests. But when the king came in to see the guests, he noticed a man there who was not wearing a wedding robe. And he said to him, 'Friend, how did you get in here without a wedding robe?' And he was speechless. Then the king said to the attendants, 'Bind him hand and foot, and throw him into outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. For many are called, but few are chosen.'" Hear what the Spirit is saying to the world. Thanks be to God. You may be seated. Where did you sit at lunch in high school? I don't know how things are today. Maybe kids are more gracious and don't have cliques like they did back in the day. I'm sure kids today are just much more evolved than I was when I was 16. Maybe everyone eats with everyone, and there are no divisions among students. I'll talk to any high schoolers after class. After class, geez, where am I? After church. I doubt that. Maybe the divisions are a little bit different today. I don't know how things break out in high school cafeterias today, but when I was in high school, I sat with the choir and theater nerds. That's where I found a home. It's where I belonged. I played soccer and tennis my freshman year of high school, but I didn't sit with the athletes. I didn't sit with the popular kids. I didn't have enough Abercrombie and Fitch to sit with the popular kids. I thought millennials would get that one. They get it. They just didn't think it was funny, I guess, yeah. I didn't sit with this term is not a pejorative anymore, but I didn't sit with the nerds. I think anymore the nerds are kind of like, they're the cool kids now, I guess. I don't know. I didn't sit with the nerdy folks, the ones who took advanced trigonometry and robotics. Who'd you sit with in lunch in high school? Because who you sit with matters. Who you eat with really matters. You can't eat with just anyone. You know that, right? It's crazy to me that it was almost 20 years ago. This is a millennial reference, just a heads up. 20 years ago now, Mean Girls came out. And that makes me feel old. It was not 2004, almost 20 years ago. But they did a good job depicting the different cafeteria cliques and who sat where. And this new student didn't know where she was supposed to sit. But it was very clearly designated who was who. Maybe for another generation, I should be referencing the Breakfast Club. Maybe that's a better reference for some of you, where you had, a bunch of different kids who were from different cliques, all show up at Saturday detention from this power-hungry principal, and they ended up tearing down the walls of the divisions between them. But, in Mean Girls, the popular table was composed of 3 pretty, wealthy, and rather snooty white girls. They have rules about how people can join their table. You wear pink on Wednesdays. It's one of their rules. You have to wear pink on Wednesdays. And on Monday, you cannot wear sweats. It's a big rule, what you wear at the lunch table. Until at the end of the movie, the head mean girl, Regina, the one who imposes the rules, well, guess what she does on Monday? She wears sweatpants. You can't sit with us. They kick her away from the table. She is thrown out into the outer darkness of the cafeteria where there is weeping and gnashing of teeth. Because who you eat with matters. Because it tells the world something about you. And in many cases, high school not excluded, it's a status symbol. It symbolizes, represents who you're going to be associated with. So was it in Jesus' day. Do y'all remember one of the primary criticisms laid against Jesus in his ministry? He was chastised for eating with whom? Oh, you eat with sinners. Now, we might hear that and think, what's the big deal? Shouldn't we all eat with sinners? We take that, we assume like, well, duh, who doesn't? I mean, maybe we don't as much as we ought, but we don't think it's a bad thing. But in that context, it was not unlike a high school cafeteria. Who you ate with said something about you. Every group that was a group would have a communal meal together. People would eat together. That's what they would do. And the meal represented something. It signified something. People who shared the same trade or profession, or they were in a guild together, they would have a specific meal that they would eat together. And they would wear the same thing to the meal together. Different religious groups would have a meal together, and you would wear the proper attire for that meal. Different philosophical schools. The Epicureans would all eat together, and the Stoics would all eat together. And they would wear their meal together. People in mourning would have a meal together, and they would all wear their attire together. You remember when people in mourning would represent they were in mourning by wearing a black band on their arm. It was a way to say something about who you are and who you're associated with. Who you ate with mattered and said something about you, your associations, and your priorities. Which is what brings us to this rather troubling passage in Matthew 22. To our modern contemporary ears, this is a difficult parable. Right? I mean, how do we say thanks be to God for this? This king seems mean, to put it kindly. How is this good news? He destroys apparently his own city. He destroys those who killed his slaves and then burns down the city, and he kicks out someone wearing the wrong clothes. I mean, the church would never kick out anybody for wearing the wrong clothes, right? But it's like Mean Girls. You can't sit with us. You're wearing the wrong clothes. You're wearing sweats on Monday, brother. You can't sit with us. And he's cast out into the outer darkness. Well, before anything else, let me add a little nuance to this text. I think we need to read parables with a little bit of nuance and recognize that parables, the way we read them, are not metaphors across the board. When you read a parable, it's not that we necessarily need to assign a metaphorical association with everything. There are allegories in parable. You better believe it. Allegories where things represent kingdom realities, but we ought not to read every parable and think, well, here is a direct one-to-one correlation with everything in the kingdom of God. You see, a parable is told to tell us something about the kingdom of God. Jesus tells parables to reveal something about the kingdom of God. It builds off of the shared assumptions and imaginations of the audience. And Jesus is speaking to first century Palestinian Jews. He's speaking to Pharisees and his disciples. So he's building off of their shared assumptions and their shared imaginations. And guess what? How many of our shared imaginations and assumptions do you think line up one-to-one with a first century Palestinian Jew? Very little. So, we read these not through the same lens. That being said, that does not mean we can't learn about God's character and God's kingdom. Parables are stories. I think if I could compare it to a modern-day genre, it would be like a cartoon. Like you guys remember when you used to read like Sunday morning cartoons in the newspaper? It's like a cartoon or like a political cartoon where things are blown out of proportion to prove a point. You don't look at a political cartoon and say, oh, wow, his ears are really that big, are they? This is like when you go to Six Flags or Disney World and you get a caricature where things are blown out of proportion. And in today's parable, the king creates this feast and says the table is ready. And then he invites the guests and they don't come. And so he sends another invitation, they don't come again. And so what does he do? He burns down the city. And after that, apparently, he sends some remaining slaves out to tell everyone else in the streets that they need to come. And he said, the table is ready. So let me ask you, church, let's think about this logistically. How many of you would want to go eat that meal after it's been sitting for, days now? I mean, he set the table, he killed the animals, he made the meal, he sent an invitation, nobody came, he sent another invitation, nobody came. He said, all right, destroy the city. And then invite more people who are going to come. Go out into the streets and take a couple hours and walk through the city again. Logistically, this would just take a lot of time. But in the logic of the parable, it's all in a moment. Because it's blown out of proportion to prove a point. The point of this parable isn't to make sure that the timeline is all squared away. That's not the point. It's to make a theological point. Jesus is trying to tell those who are listening, his adversaries and his disciples, he's trying to make a point to them. So then what is the point of this parable? That's the question. What do we do with Matthew 22, 1 through 14? I think one of the things we do is recognize that this parable is told in sequence with other parables. We don't have time to get into everything today, but go back and read specifically the two prior parables leading up to Matthew 22. Jesus is telling this in the midst of a broader context. But also some of the earliest theologians of the church and many present-day scholars share a consensus that this text is not speaking about the second coming of Christ, the arrival of God's kingdom in its totality. But that's what we think about when we read about wedding feasts. That's what comes to our imagination as modern Christians. Sometimes we think about the wedding feast of the Lamb from Revelation 19, right? When we hear wedding feast, we think the fulfillment, the consummation of all these things. Or there's a similar parable in Luke 14, which talks about the great banquet. That is what we would call eschatological. That is about the end things. Eschatology is the doctrine of the end things. That is about God's kingdom coming in its fullness, much as is Revelation 19. The wedding feast of the Lamb, the great banquet, are about the arrival of the kingdom of God with Christ. Matthew 22, however, according to scholars who are much more, biblically literate than myself, have said that this is not so much about Christ's second coming as much as this is about Christ's first coming. That this wedding banquet is not about when Christ arrives with the kingdom of God in its fullness, but that this passage is about when Christ arrives to inaugurate his kingdom. Early theologians like Gregory the Great and St. Augustine agreed that the point of this passage is to talk about the arrival of the Messiah, the incarnation of Jesus Christ, and how people respond to it. The wedding feast described here is about the incarnation. It is about the union between Christ and his bride, his church. And so this text is also about the invitation offered by God to join in the feast that was offered by the arrival of his Son. This parable says, hey, my Son is here. Let's celebrate. Come to the table. So first we see that there were folks who were previously invited to the wedding feast but rejected the invitation. And then they were reminded of this invitation a second time and still refused. And this is in line with the customary practices for those who would host wedding feasts. You know, back then they didn't have Google Calendar with alerts and a matching calendar on the kitchen wall that I'm also supposed to fill out so that I have multiple calendars representing for me what my life is supposed to look like. If I had $1 for every time both Kayla and Justin said to me, Is it on your calendar? I could retire early. But they didn't have those reminders. In the first century, they had a practice where they would extend weeks in advance an invitation. They would let people know. They would go through the town and say, hey, we're having the wedding on this date. Please come. And then the day of, early in the morning, they would send people out to go remind them, hey, today's the day. Remember, we told you it was happening? Well, it's today. Sounds very stressful to me. But that's what this king does. He sent out this initial invitation, and then the day of, when the feast was prepared, when the table was set, he sent those slaves out and said, hey, come on. But they were treated poorly and killed. And scholars have made note that this is likely a reference to the prophets who had paved the way for the arrival of Christ. That these servants of the king had gone out and said, hey, there's a feast prepared for you. Come on, come on, come on. But they were mistreated. These slaves were mistreated like the prophets were mistreated. Those who had called Israel to faithfulness as preparation for the Messiah were often mistreated and ignored and killed. And that may very well be why Matthew records this passage in the way that he does. But for us today, I think it's really important that we can recognize the reasons that people neglect the invitation of the king. The reasons that they neglected to come to dinner that was prepared for them there were two reasons listed here in the text. One said, I got to tend to my farm. Others said, I need to tend to my business. No, I don't think this is a comprehensive list. I don't think that this is a comprehensive list because I don't think that's necessarily the primary point of this parable. But I think it is indicative of what pulls people away from receiving the invitation of God on their lives. One is to trust in their own means. God prepared a feast. This king prepared a feast. But these people said, I got my own farm. I got to tend to my stuff. I don't need your produce. I've got my own. I need to tend to my things. And this maybe could be considered self-reliance. I don't need anything from you. I don't need your feast. I've got what I need. I wonder how often we reject the invitation from the Lord today because we don't want to think we have to rely on anyone or anything else. But then the other reason people rejected the invitation of the king was to tend to their business. Oh man, I'm slammed at work. I'm telling you right now, if I put in a few more hours this week, then I'll hit my targeted goal for the month. Then we can put a little bit more into the 401k. We can put a little bit more into the Roth IRA, which we've already paid our taxes on. So that's all just net right there. That is a reason people reject the invitation of the king is maybe their own pursuit of their own wealth. Here's the thing. What the king offers to these folks was greater than they could tend to with their own farms or their own businesses, but they couldn't see it. But they're the ones who rejected the king's invitation. What are the rest of the people who didn't? Did you notice who that following invitation was extended to? Let me phrase it this way. Who was excluded from that invitation? Go through the city. Anybody you find. Anyone you find, come to the table. There's enough. There were none who weren't invited. You know what's really interesting? Jesus makes it a point to say who was there, the good and the bad. This indicates to us that this passage isn't about the second coming of Christ, but is about the first arrival of Christ. Because here we see that everyone is a part of the party. There are none that are prohibited. Even the evil ones are invited to this feast. This is not unlike the parable of the wheat and the tares. You remember the parable of the wheat and the tares? Where Jesus tells the disciples not to pull out that fool's wheat, that darnel, those tares, because in the process they may also accidentally rip out some good wheat with it. He says, no, I'll take care of that. I got that when the harvest comes. in that parable, Jesus says that both the good and the bad grow side by side until the harvest, until the judgment. That's what he's saying here in this parable. Everyone's welcome to the table. Come to the table. This is maybe one of my big criticisms with my criticisms of the church. So much criticism is laid against the church for being a broken institution, for having people in it who are sinful, for not being completely perfect. Jesus said, bring them all. Bring them all. So if our churches are maybe not yet entirely sanctified, maybe that's because Jesus commanded them to be full of broken people in need of grace. So guess what? We're sitting next to each other. We don't know necessarily who's good or who's bad. But guess what? You know what is so shocking? This feast isn't the judgment. This is not the separation from the good or the bad. That's another wedding feast. But do you know what is so shocking about this? This says, everyone in town came to this feast, both the good and the bad. Do you know what blows my mind in this text? How many people were kicked out of this wedding feast? One guy. You brought everybody and only one dude is kicked out? Only one guy. I listened to the story of this minor league baseball team that had two events for their baseball to bring fans into this minor league baseball game. One was a disco celebration. This was in the early 80s. A disco celebration filled the stadium. A couple weeks later, they were going to do the opposite. They were going to have a disco demolition. So they wanted to have a disco night and an anti-disco night. It was a doubleheader. They said, everybody bring your disco records, and in between the games, we're going to blow them up. This is all, just to make people happy and excited. This was a stadium that held like 20,000 people. 55,000 people flooded the stadium. Another 30,000 outside the stadium were climbing the walls with a grappling hook. This is the south side of Chicago. Threw a grappling hook over the wall. We're climbing. It was a riot at a minor league baseball game because they hated disco. Surprisingly, no one was killed, but the entire city shut down. Do you know what they said about that game? The owner said, bring the good and the bad. And traffic stopped for 17 miles. The entire city shut down. And in this story, the entire city shows up and only one dude gets kicked out. Maybe you can get hung up on that this king is really ticked off about his attire. We'll talk about it in just a minute. But, I mean, if so many bad people were welcome to this table, why was only one person kicked out? Could it be, church, that dining at this table brings transformation? Could it be that the compassion, the invitation, the welcome to this feast is bringing people into salvation and holiness? Could it be that invitation breeds transformation? Who you eat with matters. And apparently, when all the good and bad people come together, only one person gets tossed out. But in thinking about this one who was kicked out, I mean, wasn't it a little unfair for this guy to kick this dude out of church for not wearing a robe? I mean, we like to talk about like, man, back in the day, people were criticized for wearing a hat to church. Or they wore the wrong thing to youth group, so we gave them a triple XL t-shirt. That was a 90s, early 2000s dunce cap for youth ministry. But remember how I said that different groups would have meals together. Before we read this text and say, well, that was rather harsh of that king. Reading it in context, part of that eating together was dressing together. Not unlike the jocks who wear their jerseys on game day. right? You got to wear your jersey on game day. And not unlike those mean girls who wear pink on Wednesdays or who don't wear sweats on Mondays. You can't sit with us. To dress appropriately for the meal was more than just about looking nice. It wasn't about pleasantries. It was about your association with those people. I am a part of this guild. Let me show you. I am in mourning with these people. Let that be evident to you. This was about association with a community. I belong to them. I am with them. And so, this one who refused to wear this wedding robe was saying, man, I would love to eat all this food, but I ain't with them. I would love to take part in what I can get out of this, but I don't want to be a part of y'all. I don't want to be associated with you. And the king says, brother, that is not how this works. It's not how this works. If you're going to dine here, it's because you're part of us, because you belong to us. You see, this is consecration. This is giving yourself to the kingdom of the one who invited you. You've been welcomed to this table. So be a part of us. But more importantly, according to the logic of this parable, who was this person who responded to this second invitation? These were not the ones who had farms or businesses. These were the ones who had no means. They weren't on the original list. I mean, isn't it just a lack of compassion for this king to kick out this poor man because he didn't have the right clothes to wear? I mean, he can't afford it. Isn't it just cruel for this one to cast him into the outer darkness? Well, no. Because culturally, it was the responsibility of the wedding host to make sure everyone had everything they needed. Think of the wedding feast in Cana of Galilee. Who provided the wine at the wedding feast in Cana of Galilee? The host would provide for the guests. In that culture, you would not show up to someone's house and the host would be empty-handed. We have the opposite in our culture, where you might show up at somebody's house as a guest with a gift. It was the opposite. The host had the gift. Here's the king inviting people to this wedding feast, and it is his responsibility to make sure that everyone was taken care of and to make sure that everyone had been dressed appropriately. You see, the one who is not wearing the robe was not in the wrong for wearing the wrong thing to church. By not wearing the robe, this one is rejecting the grace that has been offered to him. He did not need to show up with the gear. It was already there. It was already available. The king would provide the robe, but this one did not want to wear it, despite it being free for him. In Romans chapter 13, Paul says, put on Christ. Put on Christ, this garment, this wedding robe. It represents in this parable a life lived in accordance with the king. Ultimately, both Gregory the Great as well as St. Augustine make the case that this wedding robe represents the love of God. Put on the love of God. Augustine calls it charity. This one who rejected the robe is one who might have great faith, maybe even has the gift of prophecy or discernment, maybe even has skills and assets that can serve others very well, but does not have love. And if we have not love, we are but a clanging gong, a resounding cymbal. To put on Christ, to wear this wedding robe, is to put on love, which we receive as a gift of grace. So as I wrap up, let me emphasize something. According to this parable, the king says that those who were unworthy, did you notice the king said they were unworthy to eat at my table? They were unworthy. When does he claim their unworthiness? Before he invites them or after? After. What made them unworthy? He said they were unworthy because they rejected the invitation. The king did not declare them unworthy without first inviting them. They were unworthy. They were not unworthy because the king hadn't invited them. They were unworthy because they didn't receive his invitation. Similarly, the one who was cast out into the darkness was not cast out because the king hadn't invited him, and not because the king hadn't provided for him, but because he rejected the invitation to be associated with this feast. It was his rejection of the invitation that made him unworthy. And I think that is the point of the parable. God has extended an invitation to you to dine at his table. I'm telling you, church, I promise you, if you have never believed that God has a place for you, there is a place at his table. He has made it ready for you. Everything is ready to go. God has a place at the table for you. He does. And he does not disqualify you. He has not disqualified you. He will invite you, but he will not force you to dine there. You see, our response is to receive the invitation. So is it with wearing the robe. I do believe that this text is saying to us, and I believe it's true, that there are none that are not welcomed to the feast, which means to be associated with his people. There are none that are not invited to be associated with his people. To wear the robe, to put on the love of Christ, is to give your life to his kingdom and his ways. And I do not believe that God is in the business of casting people out. But perhaps it is we that cast ourselves out when we neglect to love, when we neglect charity. We disqualify ourselves from the kingdom table when we decide that we would like what Christ has to offer us without acknowledging what is required of us. And what is required of us but to love. To love one another and to love this world. And that's the message today, church. Because of Christ, God has invited you, even you, to his feast. And that is good news. But what is more, when we have been welcomed to this table, we wear the robe. In God's grace, he has provided a means for us to stay here. And what is that means but love? So if you have never heard the invitation of God upon your life, I sure hope you hear it today. If you've never heard the Lord saying to you, I have a place for you. Come. Put aside your farm. Put aside your business. Come. Then please join us at the table. Taste and see that the Lord is good. And I pray you know that God has a place for you. Now, if you've already received that invitation from the Lord to dine at his table, please know that it is God's grace, not your works or your faithfulness, that keeps you there. God has provided you with a garment. God has provided you with everything you need. God is not turning you away, and God does not turn you away. God is slow to anger and quick to forgive. But sometimes we turn ourselves away from God when we reject to love one another, when we reject to put on Christ. So church, do not refuse that wedding robe. Do not refuse what God is so freely and graciously offering to you today. Maybe you've been dining at this table for a long time and you're afraid that you're going to get found out that you're wearing the wrong clothes. But I just want you to be reminded that God has provided everything you need. All we do is receive through His grace. And we put on Christ. And that is the good news for us today.